So today we're going to look at animal missing links. The question we have asked before is, must the data or the evidence conform to the theory if it does not just ignore the data or the evidence? Or must the theory conform to the data or evidence if it does not adjust or abandon the theory? And of course, we have cited in the past that the correct answer would be the theory has to be subject to the evidence. Now, if we look at the two theories, evolution and creation, we can see that they are not in the least bit compatible with each other. One is supposed to be entirely natural, whereas the other is supernatural. One is supposed to be self-contained, whereas the other is externally directed. Evolution is supposed to be non-purposive, there's no purpose to it, whereas creation there indeed was a purpose. Evolution is supposed to be continuing, whereas creation is completed. Evolution is supposed to be continually building up, whereas creation is actually going the other direction, running down, less diverse, from perfect to imperfect. And evolution is supposed to be irreversible, and it's supposed to be universal. If we look back at what was known about the cell in the time of Charles Darwin, there was very little that they actually knew. They could look at it under a microscope, but their microscopes weren't as good as ours are now. And they could only see a few things. They could see the cell wall, they could see the nucleus, they could see a few other organelles, and that was about it. And so Darwin could be forgiven for thinking that the cell was a relatively simple thing, because as far as he knew, it was. But we could not be forgiven for thinking that this amazing complexity, subcellular organelles and machinery that produces complex chemical products essential to life, all inside a single cell. To think that that all came about by accident, it isn't logical. And the evolutionists haven't even proposed any models for how it might have happened. It is just presented as their dogma that we must accept because they say so. The appearance of a progression from simple life to more complex is everywhere, but there are not any transitional forms from creature to another now or in the fossil record. That idea is just too simplistic. And if it was really happening, we should be able to find evidence of it everywhere. Charles Darwin even admitted this. He said, firstly, why, if species have descended from other species by insensibly fine gradations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? Why is not all of nature in confusion instead of species being, as we see them, well defined? But as by this theory innumerable transitional forms must have existed, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? So even in Darwin's day, the fossil record did not bear out his theory, and he's recognizing it here. We could say the excuse evolutionists have, we just haven't found enough yet, and that if we keep on looking, we will surely find. But we pose this question to Google, how many fossils have been found and documented? The answer is, to date, scientists worldwide have unearthed and categorized nearly 200 million large fossils and billions of small fossils. And yet we don't find those connecting fossils that show evolution from one thing to another. We don't find it, for instance, between invertebrates and vertebrates, the two big divisions in the animal kingdom. We don't find them between phyla. We don't find them between species. Even though we have presented with this idea of an evolutionary tree where one thing evolves from another, this is not what the fossil record shows. The only place a family tree of animals like this exists is in the imagination of evolutionists. As we spoke about in our last video of fossil record, instead of an ever-expanding tree, like we see on the left here, of animal life, most major phyla appear suddenly in the Cambrian layer and then in successive layers with no predecessors and either continue to today with no evolution or become extinct and die out. Today, we have distinct gaps between the different kinds of animals: fish, reptiles, amphibians, birds, mammals. Those same gaps are maintained throughout the whole fossil record: fish, reptiles, amphibians, birds, mammals. If evolution happened, there should be abundant evidence in the fossil record of transitions between different kinds of animals. So, which is more credible? No transitional forms from one kind to another is found in the fossil record, but all species evolved from common ancestors anyway. Or the fossil record shows that creatures remain the same species and either survive to today without any evolution or have died out. If paleontologists with evolutionary assumptions came across these two skeletons in a dig, they might conclude that they were two different species, especially looking at the head bones. In fact, speaking of head bones, look at all these head bones. How many different species are we looking at? The answer is they're just one. They're all dogs. Now, if you look at the definition of species, it's supposed to be a population of organisms in which any two individuals of the appropriate sexes or mating types can produce fertile offspring. If they can mate and have offspring, then they are the same species. So what I showed you before was the skeleton of a Great Dane, which is about 200 pounds, and a Chihuahua, which is about 20 pounds. So there's a tenfold difference in size and weight on these two creatures. They're the same species. They're both dogs, even though they're very different. So if you look at the Wikipedia definition of dog, it says that dog was the first species to be domesticated by humans, by their reckoning, over 14,000 years ago and before the development of agriculture. So even though people have been breeding dogs to get certain characteristics, and we see all these different kinds of dogs, charts like this are meant to show the possibility of evolution. And people have been trying to breed different characteristics for thousands of years. And this is faster than any natural selection process that evolution could possibly be. But in spite of all of that, they're all the same species. They're all still dogs, which really proves that evolution from one kind of creature to another hasn't happened in spite of all the human intervention, which would be many times faster than any natural selection could have been. So, which is more credible? All breeds of dogs are evidence of evolution, even though they remain the same species, or species have the capacity to vary and adapt, but don't evolve. They stay the same species. Well, here are a bunch of antelope-type creatures. We have the dik-dik, the gazelle, the bushbok, the gnu, and the eland. Looking at these, you could consider that maybe they evolved one from another, except that they're all alive now, so they're not evolving one from another. Here's another typical image or illustration that you will see in textbooks that is supposed to prove the evolution of the modern horse. But if you go back and examine, you find out the first one, the Eohippus, has now been reclassified by evolutionary scientists to not belong to the family of horses, but to be reclassified with tapirs and rhinoceros. So it's not in the family tree at all for horses. The next one has been reclassified again to be different from later species. So it's not an ancestor of horses. These two come from the same geological era, therefore they did not evolve one from another, but they were living together at the same time. And so when it comes right down to it, there are no ancestors for the modern horse. These kind of illustrations have been examined and have been disproven by evolutionary scientists. So today I decided to look at Wikipedia in the article for Equidae, which is the family for horses, and this picture was right there. And each of those species was identified as the ones that have been disqualified as being ancestors for the horses. So it's just, they keep on perpetuating this stuff. Here we have a repeated pattern. We've talked about this before. Claims about missing links are given a lot of publicity, Evolutionists then re-examine the data, and then the key links get reclassified, disproving the original claim, and they're quietly removed from the missing links lists, and the old claims then still persist in popular media and in new books, as we have seen. Which is more credible? Animal missing links, publicized, then reclassified, but persist in texts and media, but evolution still is a proven fact. Or animal missing links, publicized, then reclassified, but persist in text, shows the evolution side is willing to use disproven science. In recent years, we've been bombarded with what can only be termed propaganda, claiming that birds and dinosaurs are practically first cousins. Hey, here's an example from BirdLife. It's official. Birds are literally dinosaurs. Here's how we know. And here's another article. How dinosaurs shrank and became birds. Modern birds appear to emerge in the snap of evolutionary time, but new research illuminates a long series of evolutionary changes that made the transformation possible. Well, what's happening here is that they found certain dinosaurs that appear to have feathers. These are previously undiscovered dinosaurs, been treated like a slam dunk proof that dinosaurs evolved into birds. No questions asked. But even the evolutionary community is not wholly convinced. For one thing, all of these recent feathered dinosaurs just happen to come from one single province in China and were all discovered by one person, Dr. Xing Zhu. Here's some examples. One of the professed feathered dinosaurs is called Sinosauropteryx. These are the images by different artists, ideas of how this same species looked. You can see that there's a fair bit of differences there between them. They're similar, but they're not all the same. So there's a certain amount of artistic license taken in the illustration of these things. But here is the actual fossil, the Sinosauropteryx fossil. And what they're pointing to are these little filaments on the back and on the underside of the tail that appear or are claimed to be feathers. Or could they be support fibers for dorsal and ventral crests, such as for this plumed basilisk, which is an animal that lives now? And those are not feathers. Those are, as you can see, they're just a dorsal fin. And so those are the support fibers for that. Now, I'm not disputing that there are or could be possibility of such things as feathered dinosaurs, but feathers don't make a bird. When I was your age, there was a prehistoric creature called the Archaeopteryx, and it was claimed to be the link between reptiles and the ancestors of all birds because it had teeth. You can't see it in these illustrations, but there are little teeth inside its beak. That was different from anything that they had found before in birds. But then they found true birds that were considered older than the Archaeopteryx. So it couldn't have been the ancestor of all birds. It was just a bird that had teeth. But then a different case is one of the Archaeoraptor, not the Archaeopteryx, but the Archaeoraptor. And that turned out to be a deliberate combining of a dinosaur tail with a bird body. In other words, it was a fake. Here is the entry in Wikipedia for Archaeoraptor. Informal generic name for a fossil chimera. I want you to remember that word because we're going to come back and define it. From China, in an article published in National Geographic in 1999, the magazine claimed the fossil was a missing link between birds and terrestrial theropod dinosaurs. Even before this publication, there had been severe doubts about the fossil's authenticity. Further scientific evidence showed it to be a forgery, constructed from rearranged pieces of real fossils from different species. Remember that word chimera? This is what chimera means. In paleontology, a chimera is a fossil which was reconstructed with elements coming from more than a single species or genus of animals. In other words, they are mistakes or sometimes hoaxes made by paleontologists, putting together parts that did not come from the same organism. So this was a fake. In fact, there have been so many of them that there's actually in Wikipedia a whole list of chimeras that have been found and discovered and disproven. That's pretty impressive to see that there have been that many big mistakes that have been found. Here is a list of the non-avian, in other words, not bird, dinosaur species preserved with evidence of feathers. I went through that entire list, and I did find several that look indeed like feathered dinosaurs. Got these four here, and they all look like they could be dinosaurs with some feathers, maybe. But then there were others in the same list. To me, they definitely look like birds, not dinosaurs. Since fossils don't come with tags telling us what they are, the evidence has to be examined and interpreted. Turns out that this creature, Confuciusornis, is a fully feathered bird, and it actually predates or is the same age as the feathered dinosaurs. Therefore, the feathered dinosaurs cannot be the ancestors of birds if we have a true feathered bird that predates it. That just blows the whole proposition out of the water. So if we look at what is needed for reptiles to become birds, we have a pretty long list here. Most reptiles have no feathers, and all birds do have feathers. Most reptiles have solid bones, whereas most birds have hollow bones. Most reptiles have small forearms, especially the theropods, like the little T-Rex with the mini forearms that are, to us, look pretty useless. Whereas birds have significant forearms. Their wings is one of the cardinal features of birds. No pun intended. Reptiles have no breastbone, whereas birds do have a large breastbone. Most reptiles have sharp teeth, whereas most birds have beaks. Most reptiles don't fly, and most birds do fly. The pelvis in reptiles is rotated forward, and the pelvis in birds is rotated backwards. So it's a complete opposite pelvis for birds and reptiles. Reptiles have sac lungs, whereas birds have bronchial lungs. Reptiles have three-chambered hearts, whereas birds have four-chambered hearts. And reptiles are not warm-blooded, whereas birds are all warm-blooded. There's a significant list there between them. So just to visualize some of the key points of those differences, we have insignificant forelimbs with the reptiles, where we have very significant forearms with birds. We have no breastbone with reptiles, where we have a significant breastbone with birds. We have with reptiles a very significant tail usually, whereas birds have a very insignificant tail as far as the skeleton goes. The center of gravity for reptiles is at the hips. The center of gravity for most birds is at the shoulders. So you can see that just with these skeletal differences between theropod dinosaurs, which are supposedly the closest relations to birds, and real birds, there are some huge differences. So feathers just isn't a major factor. If we look at creatures that can fly, we see we have birds, we have insects, we have pterosaurs, and we have bats. And no evolutionists have ever claimed that these evolved one from another. So the fact that we have creatures that can fly is not proof of evolution. And so the fact that we have creatures with feathers is not proof of evolution either. So which is more credible? Feathered dinosaurs prove evolution in spite of Archaeopteryx and the differences between reptiles and birds and other flying animals. Or feathered dinosaurs don't prove evolution. As with Archaeopteryx, there are huge differences between reptiles and birds. Last time we introduced a term, we're going to review it. The term is simplistic, which is not the same as simple. It's not for things that are easy to understand or deal with or to use. Those things are just simple. But when a subject is presented too simply, misleadingly so, or glosses over or omits relevant facts, or present trite, hackneyed, or slogan-like statements, that's being simplistic. Here we see a typical diagram that is used to sustain the idea of evolution, in which it shows the similarity of bones between a whale and a horse and a bat and a human. They all have these twin bones in their forearms, and that's supposed to be proof of something. To just look at things from the standpoint of bones alone is being misleadingly too simple. we could justify it being called simplistic. Whereas things like organs, which really define creatures one from another, that is a whole different ballgame. And it doesn't help the evolutionary model. That's why they prefer to just talk about bones. Organs are much more complex than bones. In the human body, there are 78 organs, for instance. Each has specialized cells and have specialized function. And many animals have organs that exist in no other creature. For example, the bombardier beetle. It has the ability to expel from its hind end really hot gas to discourage any predators or pests. It has two different glands in its body. Gland A produces hydrogen peroxide. Gland B makes hydroquinone. And when those two mix together, they form this explosive mixture. They also have storage chambers for those two chemicals. And then the explosion chamber, which has to be very strong, and then it has at its bum end aiming nozzles, so it can actually point the spray, this hot spray, to whoever it wants to. And the spray is at a temperature of 212 degrees Fahrenheit, which, as you probably know, is the boiling point of water. So it's very hot coming out of that. Evolutionists can't even come up with a model for how such a creature would evolve. Part by part, it wouldn't work. What would be the sense of having a gland that produces either of those very poisonous chemicals unless it was all completed, or a storage chamber to keep them separate, or a special explosion chamber that would be able to withstand the force of those chemicals coming together and the gases and the heat that that produces? They don't even have a model for that. And if this was in any way incomplete, this beetle would just blow its butt off and it wouldn't have any way to survive. There's so many things in the animal kingdom where there's just no way to even imagine how these things would evolve. Many animals have things in common, but they can have other things that are quite different, such as their digestive system. Some animals, like on the left there, have one stomach, but some have three stomachs, and some have four stomachs, and each of those stomachs has a different function. Let's take two of those animals. We have cows and horses, and they eat very similar food. They're out there grazing on grass in a field, but they have very different digestive systems. Can we even conceive of the evolution between a one stomach animal to a four stomach animal? Let's look at the digestive system of a cow. It starts off with the first organ of digestion. It's called the rumen. It holds about 25 gallons. It's a fermentation compartment. It breaks down the feed. It makes and absorbs volatile fatty acids. So the first part of substances from the food gets absorbed right there. Then it goes on to the reticulum, which is a smaller organ that is more forward in the cow. That intercepts feed that needs rechewing, in other words, the cud. You know how cows will chew their cud, or metal objects or anything that needs to be vomited out because it's dangerous. So that has its very unique function, the reticulum. And then it goes from there to the omasum, which holds about 2 gallons. It absorbs water and lets only small food particles move on from there. And then we go to the abomasum that holds about 7 gallons. And here's where acids and enzymes break down the feed before it goes into the small intestine. So that's the very complicated digestive system of a cow. How could this evolve from one stomach? Would it go from one stomach to 1 1/4 stomachs, and then from 1 1/2 stomachs, and then to two, and then from 2 1/2 to three, and then three to four? How would those digestive tasks be accomplished before those organs evolve? Or how many generations of incomplete organs were necessary before we get the modern cow? And how did these animals survive the transition? Natural selection, which is the way evolutionists say evolution happened, natural selection needs survival of the fittest. So for an animal with 1.5 stomachs, there's no particular advantage to surviving. Nowhere are any animals seen with any partial organs evolving. We just don't see that. So how is evolution even happening? Well, the bottom line is it isn't. Remember this too. The initial pressure on an animal to change and, quote, evolve into something else must not kill the subject at each stage. It's got to be able to survive to pass on its genes and its partially changed genes. Then the change would happen over centuries or even hundreds of generations, and it can't have a disadvantage to either get food or to evade predators during that time. It has to have appropriate mates at all stages of the change, and it has to have, in this case, complete digestion while new stomachs evolve. If it has complete digestion, where is the evolutionary pressure to evolve and have a different digestive system? And then it has to be the fittest to pass on its genes to new generations. So, which is more credible? Basing evolution on bones alone is convenient as long as issues of organs or more complex biological processes can be ignored. Or basing evolution on bones instead of organs or more complex biological processes is overly simplistic. Looking at bones, we can see, yeah, lots of similarities. Looking at organs, in this case eyes, not so similar. The process of vision in animals is equally problematic for evolution. There are all sorts of different kinds of vision in the animal kingdom. Even parts like the lenses of different eyes. Simple lens that is found in certain vertebrates, cephalopods, gastropods, jellyfish, annelids, and at least one copepod crustacean have this kind of lens that's like a suspended ball in the middle of its eye, and that projects the light onto the receptor cells. Or the middle one is a corneal eye, which has just the difference between the air outside and the liquid inside makes refraction of a kind. And arachnids have that. Some vertebrates have that, and some larval insects, not the adult insects, but the larval insects. And then we have the compound eye, in which each little segment is a unique lens and receptor that sends its own individual message to the insect's brain. And this is found in insects and crustaceans and some mollusks and some annelids. So if you look at that, the insect vision uses multiple separate visual receptors, each send a single blob of color vision to the brain. On the bottom would be the way a bee would see that scene. Compared to the image on the top, it looks very crude, but it seems like bees don't have any problem finding their way to flowers, and flies, surprisingly, don't have any problem evading fly swatters a lot of times. The insect's nearest relatives are the arachnids, which include the spiders. These two different groups, even though they're quote closely related, have very different visual systems. Arachnids, for instance, have between 6 and 8 eyes, and their individual fields of vision overlap to give them nearly complete coverage of vision all the way around themselves. Only at their very back end do they not have any vision. The kind of vision and the quality of vision in certain arachnids is superior to that of insects, depending on the species, but most arachnids have poor eyesight, in spite of all those different eyes and the overlapping fields of vision. Because they have poor eyesight, they rely more on touch and vibration and taste to navigate and find their prey. Even though arachnids and insects are supposedly very similar evolutionarily, they have vastly different visual systems. We look at vipers, which are poisonous snakes, and they don't rely on their eyes when hunting. They have very accurate infrared sensors. See those holes that look like nostrils? Those are actually infrared sensors. They sense the warmth of the body of the creature that they're going after. And so they see the heat and they strike at warm-blooded prey. Now, how would that evolve? Humans, on the other hand, have eyes that are very versatile. There are things that certain creatures on this earth can do visually that humans can't, but very few creatures have the versatility of vision that humans have. For instance, we have rods and cones in the backs of our eyes. The rods are for low light vision. So at night, after the lights have gone out and your eyes get adjusted and you're able to see in the dark, that's because the rods are at work. And when the light comes back on, especially if it comes on abruptly, that hurts because the rods have to close down chemically because they're not functioning during normal light situations. Whereas the cones give us color vision, so we can see all the different colors in the rainbow. We also have flexible lenses in our eyes, and then we have the iris that controls the amount of light coming in that enters the eye. For evolution of organs, remember, the initial pressure to change must not kill the subject at each stage of evolution. The change will happen over centuries and even hundreds of generations. It can't have a disadvantage to get food or evade predators at any stage of its evolution, and it must repeatedly have compatible mates at all stages of change, and the creature must be able to function while the new organs evolve, and then it must be the fittest to pass on its genes to the new generations. And none of those things are actually seen in this world. It's just in the imagination of evolutionists. So which is more credible? Even without models for how different organs evolved, how they worked between evolving states, evolution happened anyway. Or different kinds of animals exist without transitional forms, and different organs exist with no intermediate stages found anywhere. Can mutation and natural selection account for evolution? So here we have a typical illustration that is supposed to show us how giraffes evolved their really long necks. The giraffe's natural food grew increasingly tall, and only the longer necked giraffes could exist, therefore passing on their trait to their offspring. So over many generations, giraffes developed really long necks. So that's a very typical explanation of how giraffes came to be the way they are. But it doesn't match what we know actually about giraffes. Giraffes actually spend 80% of their year eating short plants on the ground. When they do, because they have such strong blood pressure to get the blood up to the head when they're standing up, so their special vascular system, and they don't suffer strokes when their heads are down. And they don't bleed out from cuts on their legs. So these things just don't fit. They are a unique creature that was created uniquely. There's nothing that really fits in the model that they give for evolution. Here's another example. A peppered moth is something that lived in England and different parts of Europe. And in the 1850s and before that, they were mostly gray and they matched their natural environment. They could sit on a rock or on tree bark and not be seen and eaten by predators. But then in the late 1800s, around the turn of the century, there was so much pollution because of the Industrial Revolution that the environment was very dark. Rocks and trees were black from soot, and then it became very dangerous for a moth to be gray because it would be seen very easily by a predator and eaten. And so moths turned black. They adapted to their environment. And then by 2000, when the environment got cleaned up again, and most trees were gray and most rocks were gray again instead of black, then the peppered moths turned gray again because they cleaned up. Now, this change has been used to prove the possibility of evolution. But what it really proves is that peppered moths have an innate ability to adapt to their environments, but they don't cease to be what they are, and they don't evolve into something else. Mutations and natural selection does explain the survival of the fittest, but it doesn't explain the arrival of new species. So, which is more credible? Natural selection is the mechanism for evolution. Even though creatures remain the same species, evolution happened anyway. Or natural built-in variations happen, but creatures remain the same species. No real evidence of evolution anywhere. Are there missing links between animal species? Diagrams like this would make it look like, yeah, that's possible. But there are differences between animal groups, and those same differences exist in the fossil record. Evolution is not like this evolutionary tree is not observed in nature, and it's not found in the fossil record. The only place evolutionary trees like this exist is in the imagination of evolutionists. As we have said, there's a vast difference between birds and fish and amphibians and cetaceans and reptiles. And this vast difference between these things allows us to classify them, the difference between mammals and mollusks and primates. And all those same differences exist in the fossil record for as far back as you go. There have been many candidates for transitional forms between one kind and another, but eventually evolutionists themselves examine those candidates and reclassify them into one camp of creatures or another, not as a transitional form. Now, this really galls the evolutionists, but this is pivotal. There are no transitional forms anywhere in the fossil record. What would it take for reptiles to evolve to mammals, for instance? Well, instead of scales on their skin, they would have to have fur. Instead of being not warm-blooded, they would have to become warm-blooded. Here's a significant one. Instead of combined excretion, reptiles have just one excretory orifice. Instead of combined excretion, they would have to have separate urine and feces, which of course requires separate organs. Instead of offspring via an egg, they would have to have a placenta that lives inside its mother and live birth. And instead of no milk for offspring, they would now have to have milk for offspring. So you can see there are significant differences between mammals and reptiles. Now, there have been candidates proposed for different transitional animals. For instance, this animal, the Pakicetus, was proposed as a transitional animal between the reptile and the mammal. And we've all been brainwashed to think that this has happened, but it hasn't. Now, the evolutionists have reclassified it to be an extinct cetacean, a certain kind of mammal, not a transitional form. Evolutionists don't even have a model for how animals would change from laying eggs to giving live birth with a placenta. So which is more credible? No transitional forms from one kind to another is found in the fossil record, but all species evolved from common ancestors anyway. Or the fossil record shows that creatures remain the same species and either survived today without any evolution or have died out and become extinct. Now, there are hundreds of thousands of species that are extinct, and only a small fraction of what was originally created has survived to the present day. But in and of itself, this proves nothing favoring evolution. In fact, on the left, we have fossils that are supposedly dated from 14 million years old to 505 million years old. And on the right, we have the same creatures that are alive today. If evolution has been going on forever, why did evolution stop for these creatures? And for these creatures, these fossils on the left are supposedly 500 million years to 4 million years old, but their exact counterparts are alive today. That's a lot easier to explain if they only began a few thousand years ago and if they were all created at the beginning. And these fossils on the left are supposedly from 300 million years ago to 45 million years ago. And their identical descendants are alive today without any evolution visible at all. So which is more credible? Many creatures appear unchanged to today from almost every layer of the fossil record, but evolution happened anyway. Or All creatures were created at the beginning. None evolve. Some have survived to today, but the majority have become extinct. Let's summarize what we've talked about today. Evolution and creation are mutually incompatible concepts. Single cells are incredibly more complex than was thought in Darwin's day. The fossil record does not show transitions of any forms anywhere. Almost all major phyla appear early in the fossil record with no predecessors. All varieties of dogs are still one species. Built-in variation does not equal evolution. Proposed giraffe and horse evolution does not match known facts. Feathered dinosaurs don't prove evolution. Different winged flying creatures also don't prove evolution. Missing link claims are made, they get re-examined, they are quietly deleted, but persist in texts and in media. Simplistic means describing a subject in misleadingly simple terms. Bones can look evolved, but for evolution of organs, not even logical models exist. Evolutionary trees only exist in the imagination of evolutionists, not in the fossils. The same gaps in the animal kinds today exist in the fossil record, fish, reptiles, mammals, etc. We have living counterparts to ancient fossils with no apparent evolution. And fossils show species either die out or continue to today with no evolution. As we've said before, evolution and creation are both religious beliefs, but which one fits the data or the evidence best? You have to ask yourself, with all the evidence clearly pointing away from evolution, why do they persist in proclaiming evolution as viable? And we come back to this term we talked about last time, cognitive dissonance. When a person holds a core belief so strong that when they're presented with new evidence that goes against that belief, it is not accepted because protecting the core belief is so important, they will rationalize, ignore, or deny anything that challenges the core belief. Evolutionists are having a harder and harder time holding on to their belief because the mountain of evidence against it is growing larger every day. Still, many dig in their heels and they ignore or deny the evidence, and this is an act of faith or belief, not of science. Here we have a famous evolutionary scientist, Richard Lewontin. He said, "It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence." We'll come back and define what a priori means. We are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations. No matter how intuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So he's admitting they just don't want to admit that God had anything to do with creation. Here's the definition of a priori, meaning relating or denoting to reasoning or knowledge which proceeds from theoretical deduction rather than from observation and experience, which brings us back to the question we asked at the beginning. Which one is real science? Data or the evidence must conform to the theory. If it does not, adjust or ignore the data or the evidence. Or the theory must conform to the data or the evidence. If it does not, adjust or abandon the theory. We have looked now at many different scientific issues, the age of the solar system, the age of the Earth, the geologic record, the origin of life, the fossil and coal record, and now today we've talked about the animal missing links. And next time we'll look at human missing links. So thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate you doing this.